Hello, good morning, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Death in Cambodia, Life in America. Today, I have another incredibly special guest. I am so excited to have him on. Nicholas Coffill, who is an explorer of social history. He enjoys using photography as a tool for storytelling, and he has an insane amount of experience in museum and exhibition planning. This is his expertise. And he is also the author of the most recently released title that I believe a lot of people have already got their hands on, Photography in Cambodia, 1866 to the present. Nick, thank you so much for being on the podcast with us.
Dorothy, thank you very much for inviting me, and greetings from Cambodia.
Greetings from Cambodia. I know. Happy to have you on.
Thank you very much.
So, to get started, Nick, why don't we just go ahead and talk a little bit about where your passion from piecing together exhibitions come from? Because I know that is really your main expertise.
That's correct. And certainly when I first got my decent paying job, it was in a local history museum that was, in fact, a historic house. And it was one of the oldest houses in Sydney, overlooking the harbour. It was a grand Georgian house, and it was a really beautiful building with a little garden around it. And there I got my first job, both conserving the collection as well as doing exhibition design for the number of exhibitions we did a year about social history of the early 19th century. And I was so lucky that the curator and the assistant curator were both women who were both passionate about the small things in life, the social things in life, and how photography can be used as well as objects and personal stories to tell, extraordinary insights into colonial life. And that's where I got my foundation and my passion for using photography professionally.
And you always felt like you had a knack for something like this? Is it because you felt like you were passionate about preserving history, or like what kind of made you lean towards this kind of career?
It's difficult to say. I think it's more to do with just professional chance, dear Dorothy.
Hmm.
Mum was a complete modernist. She had built a very modern house in the late 50s Scandinavian style in outback Australia.
Mm-hmm.
Dad was very much not a conservative farmer, though he was a very, very keen photographer since he was a little boy. And he photographed his life throughout his 90 years. I think that kind of seeped into a sense of how photography can be used.
Mm-hmm.
And, but yeah, that's about it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so, um, if you can maybe just kind of walk us through your career, just in quick bullet points, Nick, because I know that eventually all of it really led up to this amazing book that you had created, Photography in Cambodia. But I know that you've done exhibition planning. I know that you've done consulting, planning for museums all around the world. Isn't that correct?
That is true. And that was basically under the mentorship of a guy called Dr. Lindsay Sharp, who was the director of the Powerhouse Museum, also known as the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences in Sydney in the early mid-80s.
Mm-hmm.
And I only worked with Lindsay for about 2 or 3 years. However, it was a very exciting time in Australia because we were coming up to 1988, and that was the bicentennial of the Europeans landing in Australia to establish it as a colony. So there's a lot of government money around, and a lot of good opportunities for traveling exhibitions, big multimedia shows, big reflection on where we were as a community and as a culture.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a good time to enter the museum world. And it was an opportunity for me, again, to very quickly become freelance and start to work in different museums all around Australia, both large state-based museums down to little history museums in small country towns. And that's where I really cut my teeth in understanding people and their passions, whether they are sophisticated urban type or whether they are just really keen, passionate local historians in a small country town. that's where I think I developed some of my social skills in moving people into what I thought was a good way to present their culture and their collections. Now, by the early 90s, I was beginning to work in South Korea for the Australian government. That was only a short stint, but after being there, I got one or two offers to work in Southeast Asia. So in 1992, I packed my bags and moved to Malaysia and started working on both local social history museums in Malaysia for about 3 or 4 years, came back to Australia, failed in my attempt to do a master's, returned back to Singapore, and continued working all throughout Asia. I suppose by then, at the end of the 20th century, I'd worked in Indonesia, India. I had been to all through Europe. And I was just beginning to, when Lindsay came back on board, 15 years later, he said, "Hey, we need an exhibition designer in Toronto. Are you available short time, part time, to be a consultant?" Of course, I jumped at the idea. And then that lasted on and off for about 1 or 2 years. And then I was picked up to go to Israel to work in Tel Aviv. And then from there was more jobs in Amsterdam and the Netherlands, and then back into China, because China was really booming in the first decade of the 21st century. Because then it was a period of growth. And with growth, they realized social development and cultural development was really important in China. So many of the provincial governments were developing new museums and new art galleries and new cultural centers. And I was there at the thick of that. So again, working through Chinese consultants, it was a wonderful time to, yet again, to be a minority in a majority culture and having to understand how things worked, and at the same time teach people basic skills, and at the same time try and win contracts and do commercial hard work as well. It was really, really exciting.
Right. So I want to make it, just clear to everybody and all the listeners that, Nick is not a photographer himself, but he has an expertise in looking at history and pieces and artifacts and things and piecing together a story, generally for museums all around the world. So, Nick, where did you, this book that you had just launched, how did you get to Cambodia through all that? How did you land in Cambodia and, I guess, create, I don't know if it's a passion for the history, or how did that lead you to your most recent project?
Well, it's a small question. However, again, as the 21st century continued into its second decade, I started to form a company with a good English fellow called John Darul and an Indian woman called Bhavna Soni Shivpuri. And Bhavna and John were the leaders in the company as far as technical theatre concerned, and also putting together great speakers to talk at events in beautiful locations around Asia. And that's where John and I developed the concept of live media theatre. The idea that we're using all the elements of theatre, excuse me, we're using all the elements of theatre to help tell stories about the history of a culture. Mm-hmm. So that means about using music, using projections, using live theatre and performers, and using text and books and models and whatever you like. So you make a really rich one hour experience or a 3-day experience that will completely immerse people into the finance, the history, the culture of a certain place they have come to. So it's deep immersive work.
So would you call that kind of like a traveling virtual museum experience?
No, Dorothy. It was very much, by this time we were working for high-end banks. And the high-end banks wanted to get their high-end clients together, give them a complete immersive experience over a weekend in somewhere like Chiang Mai in northern Thailand, or Langkawi, which was one of the first geological islands that were created as a UNESCO heritage site, and say, hey, look, you come to this place, we'll give you deep experiences about the history, the culture, the music,
Mm-hmm.
and through the dinners and the parties, and people will get to build up relationships. And through those relationships, business developments occur. And when
Right.
business development occur, the bank makes a profit off it. It's as simple
Mm,
as that. It was very
right.
much emulating what happened in the 1950s in America when the arts and the business were really working strong together. When you had large companies supporting many of the major science museums around America, we were in a way, as only upon reflection, we were kind of following that model.
Mm. So how did you
So
land
how
in
do we get
Cambodia?
to Cambodia?
Yes.
Oh, there was always opportunities to, because Southeast Asia is peppered with UNESCO heritage sites. Hue in central Vietnam, the Great Citadel, Bali, the wonderful cultural, music surf island, all through Indonesia. You've got the great kingdoms of northern Thailand, Sukhothai, Lana in the north. You've got Georgetown in northern Malaysia, a
Mm,
wonderful trading port that's still operating, but is a UNESCO heritage site. In looking at all these opportunities where we could provide a fairly permanent nest, we decided that Siem Reap was going to be the goer, because
mhm.
Siem Reap was a small country town, but it was very well connected through the regional aeroplane systems. So it was very easy to get out from Siem Reap to like Bangkok or Singapore or southern China, and from there you
Right.
can travel anywhere around the world. It also had, of course, the great Angkor Heritage Park of
Mhm.
hundreds of Angkorian temples going back to the 10th century up to the 14th century that are truly spectacular in their jungle setting. So you had a steady stream of tourists who were obviously going there not for the sex industry, not for shopping in Shanghai or Singapore, but they were coming for heritage. So we knew
Mhm.
we had them in the first place. So this was going to be a great place for us to try and open up a theatre.
I see.
Yeah.
So you guys tried to open up a theater. You did open up a theater in Siem Reap.
Yeah.
Is that
And
correct?
we realized that one of the best ways to open up a theatre is to find local talent, and that happened to be a young guy called Son Soran. And
Mhm.
Soran is an expert puppet maker, using leather and metal tools. He will make these animated puppets that are supported by bamboo rods and strings, and they tell the great stories of the Ramayana, or
Mhm.
bawdy, sexy stories about buffalo people and people in the local village, where they'll change the story according to who's in the audience. So
Mhm.
it's very lively and very bawdy and very social. So
And
we
so,
developed that. Yeah,
sorry. I guess I just wanted to know the motivations behind creating a theater experience was still part of the fact because you were working for banks at it was banks at the time or consulting for banks for these cool immersive experiences, and
yeah,
it just happened to be that Siem Reap is like the center of Southeast Asia when you were looking at all the um,
yeah.
convenient.
Nicely stitched together, Dorothy. But
Right.
you've got to don't forget something that we didn't start off with in the beginning. It's my fault. I actually am trained as a theatre designer. When I was a
Mm,
young kid, when I left school, I went and
mhm,
did 3 years at the National Institute of Dramatic Art in Sydney. And that's where I learned all the basic skills that are required for working in the arts, which is basically cooperation. You
I
can work
see.
with other people who are good at design or
Yes.
good at directing or good at performance or good at lighting or sound recording or marketing. Then you're going
Mhm,
to build a really good theatre company, and you've got a
right.
good vision behind it, then you can have a reasonable degree of success. So
So how
that was percolating back through John and myself in our hearts, in our blood. So when
mhm,
we came to Siem Reap, we thought, okay, let's get back to our early professional roots
mhm,
and
mhm.
try and establish a theatre company.
So how did it go the first year, and what kind of shows did you put on there?
Well, the first shows were very much to do with shadow puppetry. But we
Mm-hmm.
found this beautiful old site, very, very close to the center of town. That was filled with, bamboo and big trees, and it was a really cool, beautiful site to enter into. So a little line of candles would lead you to a shrine, and then from the shrine there'd be a waterfall. You go inside, and there'd be some small little salas, and then you come to a bar, and then you'd be welcome. You're given a drink, and then 15 minutes later, bingo, the show would start in an open air theatre. Now, that rhythm took a long, long while to actually work together and make it work properly. But eventually, working with these young kids was extremely enjoyable. But because I came from a museum background and a history background, I realized that so many of these tourists were coming in, were like checking on their mobile phones just as they were going out to the temples. And I was thinking like, they're spending like 4 minutes in preparation, going along in the back of a tuk-tuk, getting ready to see these temples. And I thought, I reckon that I can give them a 1 hour immersive experience at night with a great dinner and a few cool drinks. And I can show you a really beautiful master plan of how all the Angkorian temples work. So they're all based on great Hindu master plans. And they're all basically built by similar methods, and they all had a very similar way of working as an economic unit within the early history of Cambodia. So how did this evolve? How did it develop? And how did it fall apart? So in 1 hour, using a model that we built in front of the audience, using back projections and occasionally some live music, we basically did what I thought was an incredibly immersive TED Talk. So this wonderful 1 hour TED Talk drew people into the great classical history of Cambodia, and it proved to be a very big success. And it just felt to me, yes, this is the way good theatre in education really works. It informs people, and they get really carried away, and they can take this memory to any temple around Cambodia, and they can get the aha, I understand it all.
So, what makes you why is it in Cambodia, Nick, though? Is it because you are passionate, or is there something about the history that you feel needs extra storytelling? Because let's be honest, there's so many other countries out there that have their own stories and their own histories that also need to be told. I know that you were in Cambodia for, it seems like a trying to open a theater, but did you know you were going to stay in Cambodia as long as you have? And, or what was it about Cambodia that made you feel passionate about truly telling this story the way you did?
Look, there's going to be a long silence here, Dorothy,
That's okay.
but look, it's all about people you meet. It could be the highest, most spectacular mountain. It could be because of the temples of Angkor, but it really is about the people you meet. And
Mhm.
people say, like, why do you keep going back to Singapore? It's such a boring town. And I say, well, it may be boring, but I've got two friends there who are just absolutely fantastic friends. And I will continue to go back to Singapore because I love being with those two friends.
Mhm.
And you know what? Really, Cambodia is about friendship, about people that you meet accidentally in a local, the local wet market, and then 3 weeks later you might go back again. You buy some bananas and some mangoes and a little bit of other bits of fruit, and you put your hand in your pocket, and you think, "Oh my God, I've got no money," and the lady just waves you off, said, "I'll see you later," and you get that kind of trust that is just it's just really heartwarming. And it's just that, like today, I got a really crook back from a local accident. But the local tuk-tuk driver just was there on the dot to pick me up, and he took me a long route to get here, but it was the quietest, most gentle route I've ever had. He just knew, and he cared for me. Little things like that, Dorothy, I think, just just make you feel great. That's why you like places, I think.
Mhm.
All that, the spectacular scenery or the superb service, I think is a cushion that you sit on, but it's not the reason why you're there.
And the reason why you've stayed in Cambodia for how many
Oh,
years
well, look, there's always so much more to learn.
now? Mhm.
People see America on the surface, but there's a rich complexity in America. And many people go, oh, I don't want to go to America. There's too many guns, or, Americans are too loud. Well, as we know, America is a much more complex society than just those two offhanded remarks. So I think that's what's wonderful. If you are constantly interested in history and in people and exploring places, then you can nestle down just about anywhere.
Mm.
Yeah.
So let's go back to your experience, your immersive experience that you created, um, coming out of the coming out of looking at these tourists and realizing that they're only getting 4 minutes on a scroll on Google before they visit a temple or know about a
Yep.
certain
Yep.
history, and deciding that you wanted to create an actual experience where people can come and enjoy.
Yeah.
Is this the Snap 150 year of photography that you did? Is this what that is?
Well, Snap happened about the same time as what we call Temples Decoded. So
That's what.
Temples Decoded was decoding the great Angkorian temples so you could
Mm,
understand their complexity in 1 hour over a few drinks. Okay. So it wasn't like a lecture in a university hall. This was a
sure.
fun experience. Um, so we did the same thing I was looking at trying to understand the modern history of Cambodia, because the other great thing that people go to Cambodia for is to understand in some small way, in a very personal way, the experience of what it was like to live under the time of the Khmer Rouge. And
Right.
before that, the sense of hope and opportunity of a young country that was coming through independence. Just like many countries throughout the world after the Second World War, many of them gained their independence from colonial powers. And there was a great sense of exuberance and happiness after that. But as so often happened in many countries, it went tits up. And, the greater scheme of global politics meant that Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam were really caught up in, really, really tragic situations for about 25, 30 years that led to an extremely depressing and sad and reflective dark period. But luckily, all these countries have also managed to build and climb back out of that. Now, I thought, okay, we've got the classical history of Cambodia managed with temples decoded. So I sat down with John and I said, come on, we've got to create something that starts basically from when the French arrived, and how French culture affected Cambodia, and then how the geopolitics of the world of the mid 20th century began to create extraordinary turbulence and change. And we realized that, I don't know whether this is by accident or not, but I did my basic research, and it just happened that the same decade that the French arrived in the 1860s into Cambodia was the same decade that photography basically came into Southeast Asia. So I
Mm,
thought, oh, okay, if we check around, and I had a very good friend of mine called Darryl Collins, he was a really good scholar. And I asked Darryl, I said, do you have any old photographs to do with Cambodia? And he waddled off into his room, came back out with this huge album of photographs. And I went, oh, wow. And then I clicked. I thought, gee, I remember when I was doing museum work like a decade ago, we were using photographs, real photographs, photographs that were projected up on soft screens so they'd be triple, or, they were soft and gentle. So I said, wow, let's use photography as the medium for telling the colonial history up to the present in Cambodia. And I thought, there's going to be a lot of problems here. There's going to be a lot of holes. There's only holes when you don't look hard enough. Just like a dog that digs deeper and deeper into the ground until he finally finds the bone. I found that there were enormous collections of photographs, both in families in Cambodia and in great museums and libraries and archives all around the world and in Cambodia. So digging and digging and digging all around the beach eventually brought up these wonderful collections. And then, Dorothy, of course, the big issue is, what am I going to include and what am I going to throw out? And
mhm,
how do you assemble these photographs into phases that have like logical leaps and logical bounds, just
mhm,
like short stories that will last for 5 minutes and then you have a little break, and you have another short story, and then a little break. And the next short story is really quite aggressive and strong, and then there's a bit of passive break. And the next one is melancholic and gentle and quiet. And the next one is more reflective and interesting. And the other one is like a big, wonderful, conclusion of everything. And everybody goes, yeah, and they start clapping. So the next thing was like to bundle up the photographs into small little themes. Like one area in the 1920s, you'd think you'd look at like exploration and new mining techniques and international travel. But in fact, I focused on some very beautiful photographs of the costume of the Royal Ballet. And then I looked at the way the Royal Ballet dancers were photographed over a 30 or 40-year period. And at the beginning, you see they're very straight and rigid and standing up, against a wall, as if a colonial photographer has taken you as a specimen. But slowly, after about 10 or 15 years, you see them beginning to slouch, on the end of a balustrade. There'll be two of them slouching, and one would have their hand on the shoulder and be very kind of relaxed, like, yeah, we've done this before. Okay, now what do you want us to do? And how about this pose? Do you think that looks good? So you start to see them coming out as individual people rather than just dancers being photographed. Until eventually, by about the 1940s, when Sihanouk came to power, as we know, he and his family decided to rebuild the notion of classical ballet in Cambodia because he realized that ballet could be a soft power to help get his way on international politics. So then we developed the idea of the Apsara dancing, something that was shorter, something more tangible, something brighter and lighter and shorter. And his daughter became the stars. Now we could actually pick up on a personality, a woman. And so we have this very beautiful woman who we know in popular history as being Bopa Devi, the daughter of Sihanouk. So going from 30 years earlier or 40 years earlier, this blank woman in costume standing straight up against a wall, to finally, 30 years later, we come into a real person with real personality who is also a movie star. So suddenly we can start to be introduced movies as well and little snippets about what Cambodia was like in the 1940s and 50s. So you can understand just by that small example how we can use photography to really create immersive stories.
But how did you choose? You're looking at you found this opportunity, to recap for everybody. You found this opportunity to use photography, and you saw this huge opportunity to kind of display the history through photography, which is another one of your passions, bringing back from your exhibition work, and thought this was a wonderful way to display it. But how do you go about choosing what parts of history to highlight for this experience? I mean, there's so many different things you can pick from.
Yeah. Look, Dorothy, that's where you have to put on your curatorial hat and you just got to research. And for me, like I love reading history. So I just found every decent piece of nonfiction, from heavy historical books to small academic papers, and just try to get as rich and as deep an understanding of the modern history of Cambodia. And also look beyond Cambodia to understand regional politics and regional culture.
Right.
And also, because we did the research on the temples of Angkor, we understood the classical background that was the foundation to contemporary Cambodian culture. So that was really helpful as well. So then, look, Dorothy, it's like when you've got 400 stories, but you've only got 1 hour, you just got to whittle it down. And sometimes you bundle up the photographs until I had 60 or 70 3-minute to 5-minute stories. So they may have, they may be more to do with military issues. They may be to the development of the steamship and the early aeroplanes and how they brought wealthy people coming to Cambodia. It may be due to medicine and the rise of contemporary medicine and inoculation. It may have been to do with princely powers and the way Sihanouk and their family, were one of the more stable moments of Cambodian um, royal history. We may look at geopolitics and the role that America was playing and Japan was playing in the role of Southeast Asia. So you have these little bites, little packets, and it's a case of like, okay, I'm going to have to arrange the packets somehow. So you try it out. You put together. You select 12 packets. You put them together, and you see how they run. You stand up and you click, click, click on a large projection screen, and you see how they run. And then John would jump up and say, hey, this is getting too boring. So what we've got to do, he said, well, look, in this area here, where we go back to like inoculation and medicine, it actually becomes very intimate. So how about we drop the screen and just have a very little screen? So automatically, what will happen? The audience will move forward to the screen because they can't see it. Well, they have to look intimately into it. And what we do at the same time, we bring the lights down in the theatre, and it becomes really intimate and really quiet. And we talk about inoculating pigs and cows. What the hell are we doing this for? Suddenly, boom, there's a big explosion. A smoke bomb goes off, and we're talking about, the rise of superpowers and, the rift between Russia and China and America in the 1950s. So you sometimes you have to make a fluid connection from one theme to another. Sometimes you have to put discordant themes next to one another or stories next to one another to jolt the audience and to realize that, wow, it's a bigger picture than just inoculating pigs.
Right.
Yeah.
So how did that do? This
Oh, it was incredibly successful.
yes.
Awards, no, raked it in. It was just, it was really, really good. I tell you what area was really interesting. We started to get quite a lot of American families that were coming back and they had either been involved in the war directly as soldiers in Vietnam, or they had been involved in like logistics or supplies, or they hadn't been involved in Vietnam at all. They were stayed back at home to look after a family, or they were conscientious objectors. So many Americans were coming through Indochina, doing the typical, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam journey over 30 days to explore the country. So we managed to pull in quite a few of that kind of crowd. And John was particularly adroit at pulling together musical soundtracks. And we had musical soundtracks that played very quietly in the background and sometimes were very explosive and loud. And there was also using music and music lighting can really draw people into the visual experience that you're presenting. And occasionally you'll have an old camera, a camera that may be similar to a camera that would have been used by a Cambodian photojournalist in the 1970s during the time of Lon Nol and when Robert was a young teenager, right? So you pull that out and suddenly people are looking at something very real, something very dusty, but something that is actually making these images that you could see on the screen. So then you can pass that camera around and it becomes very tactile for a while. So using skills like that were really, really helpful. But getting back to the music, we also found that in the 40s to the 50s to the 60s, there was an extraordinary change in pop music in Cambodia, particularly amongst the urban elite. Originally, of course, it was like swing and jazz and more continental, very French. But then as English began to become a popular language in Cambodia amongst the urban elite, then more what I call Western music from England and America came through, particularly when the GIs were landing in South Vietnam and they were playing on their local radios, American rock and roll. And that had a big influence on local teenagers in Cambodia. And that would have been, influenced Robert and many of his peers about, their experience of what it was like to be a young teenager and listen to wonderful new sounds. And we found that after the show, many of the elder American travelers were really, really upset. And they said, we haven't heard that music. We haven't heard that music since I was a kid, And they said, like, those memories of like Chubby Checker and, early stuff, on the dock of the bay and My Brown Eyed Girl. He said it's like that just brought back deep memories that made this just a wonderful show for people. Hmm.
So to give us a snapshot, Nick, if of maybe like numbers, how many shows did you do? How many people per show came, and just how long did it span for?
Well, both shows lasted for about 3 years, Dorothy.
Okay.
That would happen about 2 to 3 times a week, and
Hmm.
there'll be an audience of around about 25 people. Really small, sometimes smaller, only 12.
Hmm.
But that was perfect. Sometimes the smaller the show, the more directly you can look into the eyes of every single person as you tell the journey. And what was also wonderful is that sometimes during the heavy monsoon, we did the show indoors. Sometimes during the dry season, we did outdoors.
Hmm.
And one of the final moments of the show is when King Sihanouk died, I think, about 2014, and his cremation was the next year. Now, at the time of the cremation, it was only part cloud across most of Cambodia, and his body was put onto a funeral pyre in front of the National Palace in Phnom Penh. And when they lit the funeral pyre, the whole thing went up in flames, and of course the smoke went up, and Buddhist prayers were said, and incense was said, and people sort of naturally looked up to heaven. And they looked up to heaven, and the clouds parted, and there was a crescent moon. At the same time, everybody's mobile phone began to ring. And people looked down on their mobile phone, and there was an image of the crescent moon and Sihanouk's face in it, the old man in the moon. People looked back up into the sky, and believe me, Dorothy, whether you believe it or not, Cambodians looked back up into the sky and they believed they saw Sihanouk in the moon that night. I was standing next to a Cambodian family who I lived with, and they all believed it. They saw it. It was just a wonderful experience. Now, whether it was a mass piece of illusion, um, whether it was just sentiment, whether it was people trying to come to terms with the future and the fact that such an important past had happened in their lives, it didn't really matter. It was just the most fastest moving digital image ever in Cambodia's modern history. So to conclude with that, and then to tell the audience, now if you look around up behind you, what was there? It was the moon rising up through the clouds. And they
Wow.
go, oh! It was as if I had made this show specifically for the astronomical bodies that were hurling around the earth. They were wonderful moments when things like that happened.
So it seems like this show is the foundation for the book that you created, Photography in Cambodia. It
Yeah,
looks
too
like,
true.
yes.
So often, theatre is just grease paint and cardboard flats and light and smoke and wonderful performances, and then the curtain goes down, the season is over, and we move on and build new shows. I felt in a way that I felt that the intense work that we had done into this show, we needed to make something more permanent. We needed to make something that was more getting back to my history roots now, where you do a catalogue of a really good museum exhibition. And that catalogue can become a very important piece of information and knowledge. And also, because it's filled with lovely objects and great photographs and short little stories, it can make a really important book. So I spoke yet again back to Doral Collins, who had just written a wonderful book on the history of modern architecture in Cambodia, and got a lot of good advice from Darryl, and started searching on books in libraries and online to see how they were designed and how they were formatted, and decided that, yes, I will go ahead and I will start to rebuild this show, but from a page-by-page perspective rather than from a minute-by-minute perspective.
Did you already have all the photography ready? Or did once you decided to create a more permanent book for this, you had to search for more?
It was definitely the later, Dorothy. I was big in the head after, doing so many of these performances. I thought I've got everything. And as soon as I start to delve more specifically into like the archives in Cambodia, or the museums in Cambodia or local libraries here in Siem Reap, and start to go online to libraries in America, um, in Paris, in Japan, I just thought, oh my God, this show is so naive. This show is what I've been doing for 3 years is so shallow.
There's
It's,
so much more.
yeah, there's so much bloody more. It should have been an opera. It should have been 6 hours. And so then I just thought, okay, come on, you got to get into it. Give yourself 2 or 3 years and just get into it and trying to create something more balanced rather than something that was more emotional that the theatre will show. The theatre show was obviously more emotional, but I
Mhm.
realized the book had to be, if it was going to be permanent, had to be a bit more measured and a bit more calculated and more careful.
So, Nick, how this is the first that I've ever seen of any books out there, and it seems like the first for you as well, Nick. You've
That's true.
never you've never created something like this. So, um, w- did you expect it to take as long as it did, and how long did it take, and what was that process like, especially this being your first time?
Well, the process, I had no thinking about how long it would take. It was just like I want to make this book.
Mm,
So it was about, you unconsciously I was re-immersing myself back into the museum world of 10 to 40 years ago, where you sit
mhm,
down with specialist curators, and you work with them and get their opinions, and you slowly build up a story with their input into it. And this was very much the opportunity that I gave myself now for a year or two. Now, because I knew the overall thread, and I knew that I wanted to be fairly equally paced throughout the 150 years. I wanted basically a fairly equal amount of early colonial photography compared to contemporary photography by young Cambodian photographers. I just needed to have it as a neat pace. I also thought that let me think about this basic structure first, and then I can fill the flesh onto the bones. So I looked
mhm,
at the basic evolution of the four kings going from the 1870s up to the 1940s, and then independence and that flush of modernism, and then the rise of Lon Nol and the rightist government supporting by America, and then Khmer Rouge. Then after Khmer Rouge, the Vietnamese takeover and the internal war continuing until eventually, when the United Nations came in the early 90s, there was a degree of calm finally settled over the country, and there was opportunity for rebuilding in a very sort of more focused way. So I thought if I can just be sort of equitable, I suppose the word was. Um, I realized that I thought it's going to have to be about 250 pages, so that'd be around about 500 photographs. Now, I realized that I also had to get rid of, well, not use so many photographs as I had before in the show, because in the show, you can present, you know, 15 photographs in 6 seconds. You can do almost a little mini movie and then slow it down, and linger on one very poignant image. Now, the only way I can do that now is like, okay, take one page, and then maybe one photographer that was very prolific, or they took 7 or 8 photographs of an unusual scene. So, okay, I would mosaic 7 or 8 of those photographs onto one page. So you actually had to lean into the book and look quite closely at the little stories that were happening in each of the smaller photographs. Then you
mhm,
turn the page over, and then suddenly there's a portrait that's really large, or a double spread, a spread that goes over 2 pages. And in that spread, there's a ramshackle black and white sort of alley, and there's a young girl racing down the alley away from the camera. And that's on 2 pages. And you think, wow, what is that girl doing? Where is she going? Is somebody chasing her? Or what is she running for? So by playing the game of large and small, intimate and explosive, close-ups of her face, and then occasionally putting in an object just to relieve the relentlessness of just photographs and photographs, and also realizing that things like even cigarette packets, where you have a little cigarette card in the packets. Before you were a little girl, Dorothy, in the olden days, many cigarette manufacturers used to put like baseball card inside the cigarette packet, or chocolates were sold with little cards inside, so that when you went back and bought another cigarette packet, you want to buy 2 or 3 more packets so you can build up the entire baseball team that you follow, or you can swap them in the school ground. So these were little ways that premiums inside a cigarette packet would help sell a cigarette packet. So occasionally I found little bits of ratty things like that, and I thought, look, that's important because that photograph may have been seen by 8,000 people. Now, 8,000 people is a lot of people in 1890s or 1920 for one photograph to be seen by 8,000 people. So, okay, it's a crappy photograph and it's badly printed, but hey, many people saw it. So that deserves this little mention in there as well.
How many photographers did you lean on for these 500 photos?
It's more of a case of how many photographers did I find.
I see.
Look, there's Dorothy, there's thousands of photographers who have worked through Cambodia, but being judicious, I, in the end, used around about 220 photographers, I think, upon reflection, or around about 200. The biggest issue, to be honest, was when we came up to the last 20 or 30 years, where there's many living photographers. And the difficulty there is if you don't include another photographer, but you do include that one, what's that going to mean about your personal reputation and how is that going to affect their professional reputation? So much of that I actually put across to another curator called Jessica Lim, I'm sorry. Jessica is the creative director of the Angkor Photo Festival and Workshop that's been going for something like 17 or 18 years. It's the longest running photo festival in Southeast Asia. So I say, Jessica, you handle the contemporary photographers and you give me your advice about who you think is good to represent.
Did you find a lot of...
Sorry,
go ahead.
Josie. Oh,
Go ahead.
But then again, you may, in the photography world, one of the great photojournalists of the 60s and the 70s and 80s is a guy called Tim Page, an Englishman who was like, brawling, rough guy, constantly smoking cigarettes or dope. He was a real gonzo journalist, but he got the photograph. He worked in Laos and Vietnam and Cambodia. And he remembers very well that when the American photojournalists were coming to Cambodia in the early 1970s, trying to get a break away from South Vietnam, they needed local Cambodians to help them to show them around the battlefield because Lon Nol and their generals were not as well organized as the Americans were in South Vietnam. So there was no pre-briefing for the press corps. There's no pre-briefing to say, okay, tomorrow we're going to take you, 8 kilometers down the main road where we know there's going to be a tank battle happening. Yeah. There was nothing like that. So local journalists had to lean on local Cambodians to help them drive their cars and find out through brothers or friends who were fighting in the army what was happening where. Naturally enough, skills were traded back and forward. Cambodians helped these guys survive, and these guys gave basic photography skills to the young Cambodians. So we find a flourish during the time that Robert can remember as a young man. We find that there's about 10 to 15 young Cambodians who took up cameras and became really important photojournalists for both the Cambodian and the international press. And unfortunately, only one of them survived during the Khmer Rouge period. Many just disappeared, and we have no idea where they went to, but we just know that they never survived. Many were outright murdered because of their high profile.
Sure.
Now, 20 years later, Tim went on a long journey throughout Indochina to try and find the remains and the stories and the photographs of the great war photographers who had died during the Vietnam War. Both Vietnamese who were Viet Cong or North Vietnamese or Khmer Rouge or Lon Nol officials, whatever. He said, I didn't care who they fought for. They were photographers trying to tell their stories. And I met Tim very roughly once because I heard about his book he published called Requiem that looked at the history of photography during the Vietnam War and of those photographers who had died. And I just called Tim out of the blue and I said, Tim, I'm doing this book on photography. And he said, do you want my archive? He just said, do you want my archive? I didn't even have to ask. And that allowed me to get access with the flick of a cigarette, access to these 6 or 7 Cambodian photographers that are there from 1970 to 1975. And suddenly, it gave a richness to the book where previously it had been very poor. So little
And
serendipity things like that is just what makes the book so fantastic as an experience to build.
and these photos, can they be found, those particular ones that he gave you, can they be found anywhere else, or was this the first time that it was released?
They would have been, of course, originally used by either the American press or the Cambodian press or as tools of propaganda by both North and South Vietnamese. That's a funny question, Dorothy. Look, I know that he has made a number of exhibitions that have traveled throughout Asia
Right.
and often still traveling around Asia to various photographic galleries that show some of these early photographs taken during the 1960s and 1970s. But as far as I know, there's no permanent collection, but he would have high quality copies of the best he could get. And they're
Mm.
part of his estate at the moment.
Were there photos that were particularly very hard to get then?
Well, for me, it was like manna from heaven. It just came out of the blue. I think on the other level, of course, you have these professional guys and women working in the battlefront as professional photographers. But beneath that, there's still photographic studios going on. There's still families who are complaining about the cost of film and the cost of bread and the cost of vegetables as the Khmer Rouge started to circle Phnom Penh and it became filled with refugees. People still had weddings. People still died. We still needed to have funerals. So we still use photographs either as little memorials during funeral times or when you get dressed up and make the best of it, you have there with the baby. You've got to take a photograph of the baby, right? You've got to take a photograph of the pretty boy and the sweet girl who just got married. So all that kind of social photography still went on. So for me, it was really important that I didn't necessarily dominate chapters like that with war photography when we knew that at the same time there were photographs of farmers standing in front of painted backdrops of glorious houses, and this is obviously what their future wants to be, right? Or just daggy photographs of kids going to school. I wanted to show that the photograph can be used and still used in many different ways during periods of strife or harmony.
It was very interesting to me as I was shuffling through the book, and just from talking to you, that photography was still going on during the Khmer Rouge times, because from my understanding and from what Robert has told me, um, well, he lost all of his photos for sure with
Yeah.
every having to move, and at that point, it seemed like a time where his description of it, that there was just photography was just out of the question. People were had to give up their cameras and had to give up all the things they had. They didn't have anything on them at all, and so it was the first time speaking with you, hearing that photography was still happening during the Khmer Rouge.
Yeah. And by the way, when I was just saying that, I was saying as the Khmer Rouge were defeating Lon Nol. So now I'm
I
talking about
see.
the early 70s, okay, from
I see.
1970 to 75.
You're not
However,
talking about the actual 4 year period. Yeah.
yes. However, if we look at the whole decade, say of the 70, then we knew that even in Khmer Rouge controlled territory, photographs were still being taken. And they were
Hmm.
still being taken of senior Khmer Rouge cadres with their
Hmm.
wife and their kids, standing up, looking goofy, the kid wearing a krama in good Khmer Rouge fashion. But they're taking a photograph of the family. This isn't a war photograph. This isn't a photograph of American bombers or prisoners of war. This is a family photograph. And
Hmm.
there's grandma, the two granddaughters. Photographs were being taken even under Khmer Rouge control. And after Pol Pot came to power, we still see examples of photography being used on a social basis by senior leaders of the Khmer Rouge. Just goofing around, just doing things, greeting VIPs, or just being amongst themselves. So photography wasn't stamped out. They realized it could still be useful as a social medium. And of course, in Tuol Sleng, it was a very important means of just documentation. Yeah, yeah.
So we discussed how you had almost in the snap of a flick of a fire. What did you say? A flick of a cigarette, you said. In a flick of a cigarette, you were able to get a huge collection of photos, Nick. And that was probably, I would say, would you say that's the easiest collection that you've gotten in terms of photography? What about, did you run into any issues of getting certain photographs that you wanted? What was the most difficult era to get photos for?
Well, to be
Maybe those.
honest, I had to point the finger back to my own professional background. It comes back to museums.
Mm,
Um, it's so wonderful that museums are putting many of their collections on online nowadays.
mm,
However, no museum uses the same software system or the same layout or the same way to get into their archives. So every museum has their own specialist way. And while you may be like, I don't know, living in a particular country town and you say regularly go back to your local museum to access collections online, you become familiar with the system. But when I'm trying to find museums across 40 countries, and within those 40 countries, another 120 museums, every museum has a different search system, a different way of laying out their collections, and a different way of making a request to use that photograph, and then a different way about how you had to pay for the photograph, and another way about you picked up the receipt and had to send online the receipt back to the original department that held the collection and for them to send you a digital copy. My God, I just wanted to go around and burn every bloody museum in the world and say, listen, you guys, just get one system and do one system so it's so easy for people doing research.
I'm just trying to create a book. Can you please
Yeah,
just
yeah,
photo?
yeah, yeah. And just a simple little boy, reaping fruit. Don't make each apple so different to get off the bush. Yeah. But then
What
again, of
was
course, occasionally you have these wonderful serendipitous moments where, such as with Tim Page, he says, yes, you can have it without even asking. I struggled and struggled to try and find some appropriate images that would have been from the Japanese perspective about when the Japanese took over Indochina and the whole of Southeast Asia in the 1940s, the early half of the 1940s, for the Second World War. And I just heard online through some obscure Cambodian magazine, the newspaper, about a Japanese photographer whose exhibition was on at some local little museum. But that was like 7 years ago, right? I thought, what? 7 years ago? I wasn't in Cambodia at the time. But I found the article, and then I started to track down the author of the article to try and find out where they found the photograph from. No answer. Couldn't find it. So searching and searching, eventually I found another person who knew that journalist. And then that journalist said, yeah, it was some person in Tokyo, I think. I said, Tokyo? So, one person in 12 million. Great. Okay, have you got a lead? And so I think they worked for Asahi Shimbun. Asahi Shimbun, the great Japanese English language newspaper. I said, okay. So I Googled Asahi Shimbun, and I then Googled this particular photographer's name. And bing! Guess what? Up came a little story in the Japanese newspaper. And then I managed to get an email for the journalist who wrote that, but he wasn't there anymore. But then I wrote to another journalist, and I said, yeah, I know his sister's brother's cousin, kind of thing. And I said, what do you think? I said, oh, look, I'll go down the street and knock on Auntie's door, and Auntie might be able to find out. Well, it was this kind of thing that one lead led to another. Be persistent, don't get knocked back, be persistent, until eventually I came across the guy who owned this cache of photographs, who he found in a local market about 20 years ago, of a Japanese cultural group who came to Cambodia in 1941 to go to the temples of Angkor. And I thought, wow, yeah, I've got them. So I contacted the guy directly, or not directly, through another English-speaking Japanese person. And they said, yeah, Papa said it's okay. Just Papa said it's okay. I was like, I had 3 months of searching, and then all at the end says, Papa says it's okay. You just want to break down in tears. So, give Papa a hug.
So, were there any big challenges you would say to putting together this book? What would you say is the biggest challenge besides searching for the photos?
I was trying to be equal, trying to be measured, and trying to hit myself and say, why do I find this photograph interesting? And why would somebody else find this photograph interesting? Mm-hmm. And then I had to develop the courage of actually putting my ideas down on paper, Dorothy. And I realized that rather than write a complete document, I was much more suited to saying 200 words about this particular photograph. Mm-hmm. I would say, okay, look into this photograph. What can you see? And they say, oh, there's a man just standing on a bridge. I say, but look at the baluster of the bridge. Look how behind him is all badly broken. And look behind him, there's 2 girls on bicycles. Now, this is a 1921 photograph. You can't see women on bicycles. I said, you're looking at the wrong thing. It's the women at the background. So I realized that I was quite good at looking into photographs. So I started to develop a concept that, first of all, draw the audience into the photograph, then explain the overall scene that's happening, and put that photograph within the context of Cambodian culture at the time. So you're starting to move out from that. So, and then if you know a little bit about the photographer, then there's a little story about the photographer as well. So it was a way of creating like a consistent melody that went through the writing style for every single photograph. So the photograph may change, but I tried to be reasonably consistent in the way I look into the photograph, explain the content, explain the context within Cambodia, and then, if it's appropriate, within the geopolitics or the cultural politics at the time, and then a little bit about the photographer. So that kind of rhythm, when I developed that gave me much more confidence that what I was doing was going to work.
Well, it is truly, and for everybody, it is honestly a book of its kind. I have never seen anything like this put together. It is so beautiful the way that you have strung all the photos together. And I can only imagine, I know now that the book is out, Nick, you have been doing a lot of these book tours. How has the audience been receiving your book?
Well, I'm really chuffed. The publisher, Tuttle, is looking after the global marketing and distribution of the book.
Yep.
And any writer would know you can write a book, you can have it printed, but you got to get those printed books out to people and out to the bookshops. So they're doing a very good job in North America and Europe and across Asia. But I said I will take control of Cambodia because I know the market well. So I've bought in over just under 1,000 books so far, uh, 400 and about 300 books, and they've all sold out. And a new one will be coming in the Khmer New Year that's just about to arrive in about 2 weeks.
Mm.
So, yeah, it's going really well. I've been giving quite a lot of little short 15-minute talks, often with other authors. I've done about 10 of those around Cambodia in Battambang, Phnom Penh, and Siem Reap, and they've gone down really, really well. I suppose because, Dorothy, you know your stuff, and having spoken about photography, stood up in front of an audience before, I just love to get back to it after sitting on your bum, typing all the bloody time. Now I can stand up and get back into doing like snap 150 years of photography.
Right.
So the wheel has turned back again, and now you need to use those charms to help sell the book. So it's going really well.
Do you find that most of the audience who has been drawn to these book tour events, are they Cambodian? Are they survivors? Are they most likely Western tourists?
Oh, it's a real mix. It depends on the location because certain coffee shops or certain galleries have built up a cachet of loyal customers. So if you go to a vegan coffee shop and food bar, then there'll be that kind of a certain demographic that will come along,
Right.
and the demographic because you know the bar. So you would select a certain collection of photographs, that'll be appropriate for them.
Right.
So I always know my audiences. And in Phnom Penh, it's a bit more explosive, a bit more bigger because they've got no experience of the theatre shows. So in
Mhm.
Phnom Penh, I try and talk a little bit longer and talk like, okay, let's just find where can we find women as a theme in photography in Cambodia, whether it be women who travel through, whether they were princesses that
Mhm.
took up photography, there were none, or whether it was early journalists or young Cambodian women who are now taking up the camera as a professional choice, as a career.
Mm.
Yeah.
I'm very curious if you have noticed how certain photography, especially from the Khmer Rouge time, has affected um, survivors that have come to see the photos.
Well, it certainly has. About 4 or 5 years ago, the the Tuol Sleng S21 prison had a major overhaul in the way it was interpreted, and many of the places are left vacant, just with a metal bed and handcuffs, manacles there, with no change to the wall color or the texture or the stains, and it is extraordinarily evocative. But then they have taken one or two places where they really focus on a particular person and their life, and that allows you to get really, really deeply into a historical story that goes back like 20 or 30 years before the Khmer Rouge, but you're following one particular Cambodian until up to the time when they are incarcerated. And they've also started to look at a large heap of discarded clothing and sift back through that and do conservation work. And suddenly there's just like, a beautiful little Sunday dress for perhaps a 6-year-old girl in a pale blue and white stripes with little bows around the edge of it. And that's been carefully conserved. And you can see little areas where parts of it have repairs to it. And then there's a pair of like old undies, like just a pair of men's undies that just rough cotton, rough black cotton, and they've got a bit of tape around the top. And then there's another bit of tape, and then a third bit of tape where the old tape is broken. And in the crotch, it's all through defecation and urine. It's all like broken through, and it's been patched, and then patched again, and then patched with obviously a piece of like soft little pink daisy flannel, and then patched again. So you see this garment that has been used again and again and again. It's the only garment this person had. And you just have to keep it going. So this sense of making do, this sense of mending, repairing, just trying to survive, it's extraordinarily evocative. And I think the way the museum has developed in that way over the last few years is really, really good. And of course, there's a number of institutions in Cambodia that have been collecting an enormous amount of documentation, such as DCCAM, the Documentation Centre for Cambodia, and the Bopana Centre, set up by Ritipan. They are two centres where there's an enormous amount of easy access to the collection. There's audio-visual work done, there's magazines and books created, and there's also travelling shows that go around the country where they have used that photography and those collections to go to villages and to get them to help tell stories and bring out their own stories and memories of what happened. So photography is being used very much as a therapeutic tool and as an educational tool. It's just wonderful to see. Yeah.
Well, I can't thank you enough for this amazing book that you have launched. For me, I especially now knowing the background that you have and the expertise you have in putting together museum exhibitions, it truly feels like just that as I flip through the book, as if I am walking through a museum of photography and of history. So for myself, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful way to digest the history. And for my father as well, I remember showing him the book. It brought him a lot of emotion in different ways. It brought him sadness when he saw photos of the Khmer Rouge, but it also brought him happiness to see the other sections that you have added as the whole history. It's not just a Khmer Rouge book. It is the history of Cambodia. And so it highlights the good and the bad. So Nick, I appreciate you so much for coming on with us today to this podcast. I know a lot of my listeners have already gotten a copy of the book, including myself. Where can we find you in the future? And will you be touring in America soon? I know you're in Cambodia now, but where can our listeners find you and your work?
Look, it's available in just about any good bookshop and gallery or museum bookshop throughout America. Mm-hmm. It's also available through Tuttle, through their website as well, where I believe you can buy it for a small discount. Mm. I regret I will not be coming to America soon because my nose is still very much focused on Southeast Asia, Dorothy.
Okay.
But there's always the stars, there's always the future. I'd certainly look forward to coming if I could get there. But at the moment, there's enormous amount of work to do here, still helping to sell the book and market the book and build up new teams and build up the energy, keep the energy going here. Yeah.
Right. Well, I wish you the best of luck, Nick. I thank you so much for coming on and sharing kind of the background of the book today. Again, I think it's one of the most incredible books out there in terms of photography. There is nothing like this, nothing as thick as this, and nothing as in-depth, I feel, out there. So thank you so much for your work.
Thank you, Dorothy. You have a good afternoon and looking forward to hearing more stories about death in Cambodia and life in America.
Thank you.